In Britain at that time, being gay meant imprisonment or chemical castration. But there was one exception that directly defied the law: King George VI's ambassador. Right inside the embassy, this man openly maintained his own gay harem. This should have been a major security scandal, but MI6 stepped in to cover it up entirely, leaving this secret erased from history. Parallel to this rigid legal reality existed an entirely different world, insulated by wealth, land, and heritage. The British aristocracy and the upper echelons of the government functioned according to a separate, unwritten code. This was the environment into which Archibald Clark Kerr was born and operated. The British diplomatic service during this period was not a meritocracy open to the general public. It was an exclusive domain reserved for the sons of the elite. Entry into the Foreign Office required private wealth, education at specific institutions like Eton and Oxford or Cambridge, and familial connections. This system created a closed loop of governance known as the Old Boy Network. The men who formulated British foreign policy shared a collective background and a mutual understanding that the rules governing the lower classes did not necessarily apply to them, provided they maintained the outward dignity of their positions and served the interests of the British Empire. Protection of the establishment was the highest priority. Scandals involving the aristocracy were actively suppressed by the authorities, the press barons, and the police leadership, who frequently shared the same social circles as the politicians and diplomats they were supposed to monitor. Archibald Clark Kerr entered the diplomatic service in 1906, his background perfectly aligned with the requirements of the Foreign Office. Born into a Scottish landowning family, he possessed the requisite pedigree and the financial independence necessary to sustain a career in international diplomacy. The early years of his service saw Im deployed to a series of critical global capitals: Berlin, Buenos Aires, Washington, and Rome. In these postings, he quickly demonstrated a high degree of geopolitical intelligence. He was not a traditional rigid bureaucrat. He possessed a distinct ability to analyze complex political landscapes and forge personal relationships with foreign leaders and power brokers. The Foreign Office recognized him as a highly effective asset. His assessments were accurate. His negotiations yielded tangible benefits for British trade and security, and he understood the mechanics of power on a global scale. As his career advanced, his value to the British government increased, and consequently, the institutional shield protecting him grew stronger. However, the higher Clark Kerr ascended within the diplomatic hierarchy, the more scrutiny his personal life risked attracting. A senior diplomat representing the British Crown was expected to project stability and conform to traditional societal norms. An unmarried ambassador of a certain age frequently drew unwanted questions and suspicion, both from the press and from conservative elements within the government. To secure his position and deflect any potential inquiries into his private affairs, Clark Kerr executed a highly calculated social maneuver. In 1929, while stationed in South America, he married Maria Teresa Diaz Salas. Maria Teresa was a member of the Chilean aristocracy, hailing from a wealthy and influential family in Santiago. She was nearly 3 decades younger than Clark Kerr. The union was fundamentally a marriage of convenience and a highly calculated strategic alliance. For Maria Teresa, the marriage offered elevation into the highest ranks of European diplomatic society and the prestige of a British title. For Clark Kerr, she provided the ultimate cover. She was elegant, socially adept, and perfectly suited to the role of an ambassador's wife. She hosted dinners, attended official functions, and presented the exact EU image of domestic normalcy that the British Foreign Office and the international press required. This marriage functioned as a highly effective operational shield. By placing Maria Theresa at the forefront of his public life, Clark Kerr created a firewall between his official duties and his private inclinations. The British establishment required an optics-based compliance. As long as the ambassador stood beside his wife on the balcony of the embassy and hosted the king's birthday celebrations with appropriate decorum, they possessed no desire to look further. The marriage neutralized the threat of the Labouchere Amendment and the moral policing of the era. It demonstrated a profound understanding of how the British class system operated. Conformity in the public sphere purchased absolute freedom in the private sphere. With his aristocratic credentials established and his societal obligations fulfilled through his marriage, Clark Kerr cemented his status as a protected entity. He was now fully insulated from the judicial machinery that routinely destroyed the lives of ordinary citizens. For the exact same behaviors he would soon practice openly within the walls of British embassies worldwide. Behind the heavy polished doors of the British embassies where he resided, the reality of Archibald Clark Kerr's daily existence sharply contradicted the public image he so carefully maintained. While the formal reception rooms hosted prime ministers, military generals, and global royalty under the watchful eye of his wife, the private quarters of the ambassador operated by an entirely different set of rules. His personal preferences were unambiguous and deeply rooted in the specific class dynamics of the era. He sought the companionship of young working-class men, a demographic discreetly and somewhat brutally referred to in the upper echelons of British society as rough trade. In the rigidly stratified environment of early 20th century Britain, interactions across class lines were strictly governed. For an aristocrat to engage intimately with the working class was considered a severe transgression, a betrayal of the social order. Yet within the clandestine subculture of the elite, it was a recognized pattern. It offered a psychological detachment from the stifling expectations of their own class. For Clark Kerr, this was not a series of fleeting hidden indiscretions conducted in the shadows of public parks. It was an organized, boldly maintained lifestyle. He systematically surrounded himself with young male attendants, valets, drivers, and personal staff who fit this precise profile. Many of these men were foreigners, recruited during his various international postings, adding another layer of separation from the British social hierarchy. The physical nature of an embassy provided the perfect infrastructure for this dual existence. Under international law, an embassy is considered the sovereign territory of the nation it represents. The local police forces of Baghdad, Santiago, or Shanghai had no jurisdiction to enter the grounds or investigate the activities within. This legal barrier provided an absolute physical shield. Within the walls of his diplomatic compounds, Clark Kerr functioned much like a feudal lord. He controlled the environment completely. The junior diplomats, the administrative staff, and the security personnel were all entirely aware of the ambassador's private arrangements. They saw the young men who lived in his quarters and understood their actual roles. However, the culture of the British Foreign Office guaranteed their silence. The system demanded absolute deference to senior rank. To report the ambassador for moral failings or legal violations would not trigger a righteous investigation. It would result in the immediate destruction of the junior officer's career. The unwritten law of the establishment dictated that you did not turn on your own. The Official Secrets Act, designed to protect national security, was implicitly weaponized to protect the personal reputations of the elite. The entire staff became complicit. They quietly turned a blind eye to the logistics of the ambassador's private life, all while projecting an image of absolute decorum to the outside world. This complicity extended far beyond the immediate embassy staff. Back in London, within the shadowed corridors of Whitehall, the highest levels of the British government were fully informed. Intelligence agencies, specifically MI6 and the security services, possess a fundamental mandate to vet individuals holding high-level security clearances. They meticulously build dossiers on their own diplomats to assess their vulnerability to foreign blackmail. There is no historical doubt that Clark Kerr's file contained explicit details regarding his sexual orientation and his active pursuit of working-class men. In any ordinary government department, for any ordinary civil servant, this intelligence would have resulted in immediate dismissal, public disgrace, and likely criminal prosecution. Yet the intelligence assessments of Clark Kerr led to a completely different outcome. The Foreign Office engaged in a cold, calculating exercise of risk management. By the late 1930s, the global geopolitical landscape was rapidly deteriorating. The rise of fascism in Europe, the aggressive expansion of the Japanese Empire in Asia, and the unpredictable maneuvers of the Soviet Union created an environment of unprecedented volatility. Traditional, rule-bound diplomats, men who strictly adhered to protocol and conventional morality, were frequently paralyzed by these fast-moving crises. They failed to understand the brutal realities of the impending conflicts. Clark Kerr conversely thrived in chaos. He possessed an extraordinary capacity for strategic empathy, able to understand the motivations of warlords, dictators, and revolutionaries. During his posting to China in the midst of the devastating Japanese invasion, he demonstrated a remarkable physical and psychological resilience. He traveled into active war zones, established direct lines of communication with Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, and simultaneously maintained crucial contacts with the emerging communist factions. He delivered actionable intelligence and negotiated complex treaties under impossible conditions. He secured vital British interests and supply lines when conventional diplomacy had entirely collapsed. The mandarins in London reviewed these results and made a definitive choice. They weighed the legal and moral liabilities of his private life against his undeniable strategic outputs. The mathematics of empire heavily favored his retention. In the face of global war, the Foreign Office treated morality as a dispensable domestic luxury. The British government adopted a stance of extreme, institutionalized pragmatism. As long as Clark Kerr continued to deliver diplomatic victories and navigate the lethal politics of foreign capitals, the intelligence services and the Foreign Office would willingly shred, burn, or bury any reports detailing his private affairs. They actively chose to protect him. This institutional hypocrisy was absolute. The laws that destroyed the lives of ordinary citizens in London were suspended for the men who managed the empire abroad. Clark Kerr's value as an instrument of statecraft essentially immunized him against the justice system of his own country. As the 1930s drew to a close, and Britain found itself plunged into an existential fight for survival against Nazi Germany, the demand for ruthless, effective diplomats reached its peak. Winston Churchill, a leader who fundamentally understood the utility of brilliant but flawed men, required envoys capable of negotiating with the most dangerous figures on the world stage. He did not need men of impeccable moral standing. He needed men who could secure victory. The greatest diplomatic challenge of the Second World War lay in the East. Britain required a functional, reliable alliance with the Soviet Union to crush the German war machine. Establishing this alliance meant dealing directly with Joseph Stalin, a paranoid, deeply suspicious, and utterly ruthless dictator who despised the traditional British aristocracy. Sending a conventional diplomat to Moscow would be entirely ineffective. Churchill needed a survivor, a pragmatist, a man who understood power stripped of all its civilized illusions. He needed a negotiator who could operate in an environment where the normal rules of human conduct did not apply. Archibald Clark Kerr, a man who had spent his entire life successfully manipulating the rules to ensure his own survival, was recognized as the indispensable candidate for the most critical assignment of the 20th century. In February of 1942, the world was fracturing, and the survival of the British Empire hinged entirely on the frozen, blood-soaked plains of the Eastern Front. Winston Churchill faced a terrifying reality. The German Wehrmacht had smashed into the Soviet Union the previous summer, advancing with terrifying speed. If the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of the Nazi invasion, Adolf Hitler would secure total control of the European continent, along with the vast oil reserves of the Caucasus. Britain, isolated and exhausted, would be the next and final target. Churchill desperately needed Joseph Stalin to hold the line, to absorb the massive casualties, and to keep the German military engaged in a brutal war of attrition. To ensure this fragile, unnatural alliance between a deeply conservative British Prime Minister and a communist dictator held firm, Churchill needed a very specific kind of envoy in Moscow. The previous British ambassador, Sir Stafford Cripps, had been a disaster. Cripps was an austere, rigid intellectual who completely alienated the Soviet leadership. He approached diplomacy with a stiff, moralizing tone that Stalin found both tedious and insulting. The Kremlin was a place of extreme paranoia, ruthless pragmatism, and late-night vodka-soaked endurance tests. It was an environment that crushed traditional British diplomats who relied on protocol and polite conversation. Churchill understood that the standard playbook of the Foreign Office was useless in the Soviet Union. He looked past the roster of conventional candidates and selected Archibald Clark Kerr. When Clark Kerr arrived in the Soviet Union, the government had been evacuated from Moscow to the provincial city of Kuibyshev due to the German advance. The conditions were bleak, freezing, and steeped in a heavy atmosphere of fear. The local population was starving, and the secret police, the NKVD, watched every movement of the foreign diplomats. But instead of retreating into the temporary British embassy and complaining about the lack of amenities, Clark Kerr immediately adapted to the harsh environment. He stripped away the pomp and arrogance typically associated with an emissary of the British Crown. He understood instinctively that to survive and succeed in Stalin's orbit, he had to project an entirely different persona. He leaned heavily into his own pragmatic worldview, showcasing a genuine curiosity about Soviet culture and a distinct lack of aristocratic pretense. He did not lecture the Soviet officials. He drank with them, argued with them in blunt terms, and displayed a tough, resilient physical stamina that earned their wary respect. He famously kept unconventional hours, perfectly mirroring Stalin's own nocturnal schedule, making himself available for sudden, high-stakes meetings deep in the middle of the night. Where other diplomats saw the Soviet leadership as inscrutable monsters, Clark Kerr saw them as ruthless politicians who respected strength and straightforward dealing. He forged a working relationship with Vyacheslav Molotov, the cold and calculating Soviet foreign minister, and eventually he secured regular direct access to Stalin himself. This was an unprecedented diplomatic achievement. Stalin, a man who trusted absolutely no one, found a bizarre sense of common ground with the Scottish aristocrat. He appreciated Clark Kerr's dry wit, his unsentimental view of global politics, and his willingness to bypass bureaucratic red tape to get things done. It was within this intense, highly pressurized, and deeply isolated environment that Clark Kerr's private life once again intersected with his diplomatic reality, this time with stakes of life and death. The British embassy in Moscow was a fortress, but it was a compromised one. Every wall was likely bugged by the NKVD, and every local staff member was assumed to be an informant. Living under this constant, suffocating surveillance took a severe psychological toll on the diplomatic staff. To maintain his equilibrium, Clark Kerr sought the familiar comforts of his established lifestyle. He required a personal valet, someone to manage his immediate needs, provide physical therapy through massage, and offer the private companionship he had always relied upon to counter the severe isolation of his post. He found this companionship in a young man named Evgeny Yost. Yost was 24 years old, and in the social and political hierarchy of the Soviet Union in 1942, he was essentially a ghost walking among the living. Evgeny Yost was a Volga German. The danger surrounding Yost was tied directly to the brutal domestic policies of the Soviet state. The Volga Germans, ethnic Germans, who had lived along the Volga River since the era of Catherine the Great, were deeply integrated into the agricultural fabric of the country. However, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin's paranoia reached absolute limits. He viewed the entire population of Volga Germans, nearly 500,000 men, women, and children, as a massive fifth column, potential saboteurs and spies who would naturally sympathize with the advancing German army. In August 1941, the Soviet government issued a sweeping decree abolishing the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Entire communities were rounded up at gunpoint, packed into cattle cars, and deported to remote freezing settlements in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Thousands died in transit. Those who survived were forced into hard labor. Simply possessing a German surname or being identified as a Volga German was a one-way ticket to the Gulag or immediate execution. Somehow, amid this massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, young Evgeny Yost had managed to remain in Moscow, avoiding the initial wave of deportations. His existence in the capital was precarious, a daily exercise in avoiding the gaze of the authorities. Taking a job within a foreign embassy was incredibly dangerous, as it automatically flagged a Soviet citizen for intense NKVD scrutiny. Yet the alternative was the street, starvation, and inevitable discovery. Yost entered the service of the British ambassador, stepping into the highly complex, insulated bubble of Clark Kerr's private quarters. Yost officially served as the ambassador's masseur and personal valet. The physical toll of the Moscow posting was immense. The bitter cold, the rationing, and the relentless stress of wartime negotiations left Clark Kerr physically exhausted. Yost provided a vital service, offering physical relief and a quiet domestic routine amidst the chaos of the war. But the relationship, consistent with Clark Kerr's established history, went deeper than employer and servant. In the heart of the Kremlin's domain, under the active surveillance of the world's most aggressive secret police, the ambassador of the British Empire engaged in a close personal relationship with a member of a severely persecuted minority. The irony was staggering. Outside the embassy walls, the Soviet state was actively attempting to erase Jost's people from existence. Inside the embassy, protected by the invisible shield of diplomatic immunity and the immense geopolitique value of the man he served, Jost found a strange temporary sanctuary. The NKVD knew exactly who Jost was. They knew his ethnicity, they knew his background, and they certainly knew the exact nature of his relationship with the British ambassador. Lavrenti Beria, the terrifying head of the secret police, undoubtedly read daily intelligence briefs detailing the activities within Clark Kerr's private rooms. Yet, the Soviet authorities did nothing. They did not arrest Jost. They did not drag him out of the embassy. Just as the British Foreign Office in London chose to ignore the ambassador's personal life because of his strategic value, the Soviet leadership made the exact same calculation. Stalin and Beria recognized that Clark Kerr was the vital link to Churchill. He was the man securing the shipments of British tanks, aircraft, and raw materials that were keeping the Red Army fighting. Attempting to blackmail the ambassador over a young male companion was a flawed strategy. Clark Kerr was entirely unashamed of his preferences, and the British establishment was already fully aware of them. There was no leverage to be gained. Furthermore, moving against Jost would anger the ambassador, potentially disrupting the critical flow of Allied aid. Therefore, a silent pragmatic truce was established. The Soviet state temporarily suspended its policy of ethnic persecution for an audience of one, allowing Jost to exist safely within the shadow of the ambassador's immense political capital. For 4 brutal years, this arrangement held. Clark Kerr navigated the turning of the tide in the war. He was instrumental during the major Allied conferences, traveling to Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, acting as the crucial interpreter of Stalin's intentions for Churchill, and later for the Americans. He watched the German army be pushed back across Eastern Europe, and he witnessed the agonizing birth of what would soon become the Cold War. As the war in Europe finally ended in 1945, the geopolitical landscape fractured once again. The alliance of necessity between the West and the Soviet Union immediately began to dissolve, replaced by mutual suspicion and hostility. By early 1946, Clark Kerr's mission in Moscow was complete. His success in maintaining the Anglo-Soviet alliance through the darkest days of the war had elevated his status to the absolute pinnacle of the diplomatic service. He was granted a peerage, officially becoming Lord Inverchapel. In recognition of his unparalleled skills, the British government gave him the most important post in the post-war world. He was appointed the British ambassador to the United States. He was ordered to pack his bags and relocate to Washington, D.C., to help forge the new transatlantic alliance against the very country he had just spent 4 years working alongside. The promotion presented Lord Inverchapel with a severe personal crisis. His departure from Moscow meant the immediate dissolution of the protective bubble surrounding Evgeny Jost. The moment the ambassador boarded an aircraft to leave the Soviet Union, Jost would lose his employment and his diplomatic cover. The NKVD, no longer restrained by the need to placate a sitting ambassador, would instantly arrest him. As a Volga German who had spent 4 years in intimate contact with a high-ranking Western diplomat, his fate was sealed. He would be accused of espionage, brutally interrogated in the basement of the Lubyanka prison, and either shot or sent to die in the deepest, most lethal camps of the Gulag system. Lord Inverchapel refused to accept this outcome. Despite the absolute coldness he often displayed in matters of statecraft, he possessed a fiercely loyal streak regarding the men he brought into his inner circle. He determined that he would take Yost with him. Leaving the Soviet Union as a Soviet citizen was practically impossible in 1946. The Iron Curtain was already descending. Exit visas were rarely granted, even to loyal party members. A loan to a targeted ethnic minority. Standard diplomatic requests through the Soviet Foreign Ministry would be instantly denied, and attempting to smuggle Yost out of the country was a suicidal risk that would cause an international incident. Lord Inverchapel realized that standard procedures were useless. He had to bypass the entire bureaucratic apparatus of the Soviet state. He had to take his request to the only man in the country whose word was absolute law. In a move of staggering diplomatic audacity, Lord Inverchapel drafted a direct personal petition to Joseph Stalin. Bypassing any pleas for mercy or human rights, he leveraged his understanding of the Soviet premier. He framed the request purely as a personal favor between two men who had shared the burden of a grueling war. He requested that Stalin grant an exit visa to Evgeny Yost, identifying him simply as his personal masseur and valet, stating that his ongoing services were necessary for the ambassador's health and well-being as he took up his new post in Washington. It was an extraordinary document. Here was the highest representative of the British Crown, a newly minted lord, directly asking the most ruthless dictator of the 20th century to personally intervene and overturn the laws of the Soviet state to spare one specific young working-class man. The petition reached Stalin's desk. The Soviet premier reviewed the request. Stalin was a man who ordered the executions of his closest friends, purged his own military leadership, and condemned millions to starvation without a second thought. He cared absolutely nothing for the life of Evgeny Yost. If the request had come from any other diplomat, it would have been laughed at, and Yost would have disappeared the next day. For Stalin, the decision relied on cold, calculating geopolitical mathematics. Washington, D.C. was the new center of global power, and the United States was rapidly becoming the Soviet Union's primary adversary. Intelligence historians suggest Stalin saw the immense value in having a British ambassador in Washington who harbored a personal sense of gratitude toward him. Defying the massive machinery of his own state, Stalin reviewed the unprecedented request and signed the exit visa. The machinery of the Soviet state instantly reversed course. The terrifying bureaucracy that was designed to trap and destroy men like Yost suddenly parted. The exit visa was issued, stamped, and delivered to the British embassy. It was a triumph of pure, unfiltered personal power over national law. Lord Inverchapel had successfully leveraged his immense strategic value and the complex relationship he had built with a tyrant to secure the life of the man he cared for. When Lord Inverchapel departed Moscow to take up his new critical role in the United States, Evgeny Yost traveled with him, crossing the heavily guarded borders of the Soviet Union, not as a persecuted fugitive, but as a legally protected companion of the British ambassador. Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1946 was a city undergoing a massive transition. The Axis powers were defeated, but the brief sense of global relief was already evaporating. The American capital was rapidly transforming into the command center of a new, arguably more dangerous global conflict. The Truman administration was beginning to formulate the policies of containment that would define the Cold War. The United States possessed the atomic bomb, an intact industrial base, and unprecedented global influence. Britain, by contrast, was victorious but entirely bankrupt. The empire was fracturing, its cities were in ruins, and its economy was heavily dependent on American financial assistance. When Archibald Clark Kerr arrived in the United States, newly elevated to the peerage as Lord Inverchapel, his mandate was brutally clear. He was sent to secure American money, specifically the massive loans required to keep the British economy afloat, and to forge a permanent military and intelligence alliance to counter the Soviet threat. He took up residence at the British Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue, a massive, imposing structure designed to project imperial power, and, true to the arrangement he had forged with Stalin, he brought Evgeny Yost with him. The relocation of Yost from the freezing, heavily monitored streets of Moscow to the affluent, humid avenues of Washington presented a stark contrast. In the Soviet Union, Yost had faced sudden execution or the Gulag. In America, he faced an entirely different kind of state apparatus. He was now a Soviet citizen residing in the diplomatic corps of the United States at the exact moment anti-communist paranoia was taking root. Yet, just as he had been protected by the ambassador's status in Moscow, Yost was shielded by the walls of the British Embassy in Washington. Lord Inverchapel integrated him seamlessly into the embassy staff, continuing the established routine of personal service and private companionship. However, the surveillance apparatus in Washington operated on a fundamentally different frequency than the NKVD. The Soviet secret police relied on blunt terror, informers, and brute force. In the United States, domestic intelligence was the exclusive domain of J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hoover had built the FBI into a modern, highly bureaucratic, and relentlessly efficient intelligence machine. Unlike the Soviets, who focused primarily on political loyalty and state security, Hoover possessed a deep, enduring obsession with the personal morality of public figures. He understood that knowledge of private transgressions was a form of absolute currency in Washington. Hoover systematically collected information on the sexual habits, financial indiscretions, and personal failings of politicians, judges, and foreign diplomats. He stored this data in his infamous private files. He weaponized morality. If you were a public figure in Washington and you engaged in behavior that fell outside the rigid conservative norms of the era, the FBI made it their business to know. And in the late 1940s, there was no transgression Hoover targeted more aggressively than homosexuality. The FBI viewed homosexuality not just as a moral failing or a criminal act under local laws, but as a severe critical threat to national security. The prevailing intelligence theory of the era dictated that homosexual men were inherently unstable, weak-willed, and highly susceptible to blackmail by hostile foreign powers. This ideology would soon culminate in the Lavender Scare, a brutal systematic purge of the American federal government. Thousands of civil servants, military personnel, and private contractors would be hunted down, interrogated, publicly humiliated, and fired simply for being gay. The American state machinery was preparing to crush its own citizens with bureaucratic efficiency. This was the environment Lord Inverchapel walked into. He made no effort to change his lifestyle. The same arrogance, or perhaps the same pragmatic calculation, that allowed him to openly maintain young male attendance in Baghdad, Shanghai, and Moscow continued in Washington. He frequented specific social circles, patronized establishments known quietly to cater to rough trade, and continued his private associations with working-class men. He immediately tripped the wires of Hoover's surveillance network. The FBI closely monitored the diplomatic corps, recognizing that foreign embassies were the primary vectors for international espionage. When Lord Inverchapel arrived, the Bureau naturally assigned agents to track his movements, identify his contacts, and build a baseline profile of the new British ambassador. It did not take long for the field agents to report back on the ambassador's distinct personal habits. The FBI began compiling a highly classified, heavily detailed dossier on Lord Inverchapel. Agents documented the young man entering and leaving his privé to quarters. They tracked his movements through the city and noted his associations. For Hoover, this dossier represented a monumental intelligence find. The top representative of the United Kingdom, America's most vital ally, was engaging in behavior that Hoover actively classified as a severe security vulnerability. Furthermore, the ambassador was keeping a Soviet citizen, Evgeny Yost, in close proximity, a fact that undoubtedly sent alarm bells ringing throughout the upper echelons of the FBI. The situation on paper was a catastrophic security breach waiting to happen. According to the strict protocols Hoover enforced upon the American government, Lord Inverchapel should have been immediately exposed, declared persona non grata, and expelled from the country. Yet, Hoover did not leak the dossier to his allies in the press. He did not dispatch agents to arrest the young men associating with the ambassador to force a public scandal. The files remained locked away. The reason for this inaction was rooted in the same geopolitical calculations that had protected the ambassador throughout his entire career. The Anglo-American relationship in 1946 was delicate and essential. The Truman administration was laying the groundwork for the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. They were beginning the early negotiations that would eventually lead to the formation of NATO. The American government absolutely needed the cooperation of the British establishment. Triggering a massive scandal that would destroy the British ambassador would humiliate the government in London, derail critical financial negotiations, and cause severe damage to the alliance at the exact moment a united front against the Soviet Union was required. Hoover, despite his moral crusades, was ultimately a political survivor. He recognized that taking down Lord Inverchapel would anger the State Department and the White House. The diplomatic fallout would be too costly. Therefore, the dossier was retained not for destruction, but for leverage. Intelligence historians widely believe Hoover retained these files as geopolitical leverage, a silent threat kept in reserve should the British ever prove uncooperative. The law, once again, was suspended for the sake of international statecraft. The British intelligence services, particularly MI6, and the security officers within the British embassy were entirely aware of the FBI's surveillance. The intelligence relationship between the U.S. and the UK was close, and information regarding Hoover's interests frequently flowed back to British handlers. The Foreign Office knew that their ambassador was actively accumulating a massive FBI file regarding his sexual activities. If Lord Inverchapel had been a junior clerk in the visa department, British security would have quietly placed him on a boat back to London the next morning and dismissed him from the service. The risk of American blackmail would have been deemed unacceptable, but Inverchapel was not a clerk. He was the architect of the wartime alliance with Stalin, a peer of the realm, and a diplomat of unparalleled experience. The British establishment deployed its standard operational defense mechanism. They did not confront the ambassador, nor did they attempt to force him to change his behavior. Instead, they managed the environment around him. Embassy security ensured that his private engagements remained physically discreet, minimizing the risk of a local police encounter that even Hoover could not suppress. They relied on the deep institutional understanding between the British and American governments. The elite were off limits. MI6 calculated that Hoover would not strike, and they were correct. The hypocrisy of the situation in Washington was profound. While the FBI and the Civil Service Commission were actively drafting policies to hunt down and fire low-level American government clerks for their sexual orientation, the director of the FBI and the entire intelligence apparatus of TUW, O Nation silently conspired to protect a man doing exactly the same thing. Lord Inverchapel sat at the absolute center of the burgeoning Cold War, negotiating billion-dollar loans and military alliances, while maintaining a lifestyle that would have sent a working-class man in London to prison, or an American citizen to the unemployment line. He was shielded by a remarkable convergence of institutional power. The British aristocratic system refused to punish its own. The global intelligence community valued his geopolitical skills over his personal liabilities. And the fragile state of the post-war world made his continued presence in Washington a strategic necessity. He was an untouchable entity, navigating the most highly surveilled city in the world with absolute impunity, proving that at the highest levels of government, morality is not a fixed law, but a highly negotiable condition. The assignment in Washington was, in many ways, the most complex and exhausting of Lord Inverchapel's extensive career. He had survived the physical dangers of wartime China and the psychological terrors of Stalin's Moscow, but the American capital presented an entirely different kind of battlefield. The danger here was not assassination or military defeat. It was national bankruptcy. Great Britain had emerged from the Second World War victorious but financially ruined. The empire was liquidating its assets to pay for basic survival. The newly elected Labour government in London, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, was attempting to build a domestic welfare state while the country's treasury was effectively empty. Lord Inverchapel's primary mission was to secure a massive financial lifeline from the United States government. The framework for a multi-billion-dollar loan had been negotiated by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, but the actual execution of the deal, the political maneuvering required to force it through a deeply skeptical American Congress, fell squarely on the shoulders of the British Embassy. The political climate in Washington was aggressively hostile to British interests. Many American lawmakers were staunch isolationists who believed the United States had already done enough for Europe. Furthermore, conservative politicians despised the idea of American capitalist dollars being used to subsidize a socialist government in London. Inverchapel found himself navigating a profound contradiction. He was a titled aristocrat, the embodiment of the old imperial order, ordered to act as the primary salesman for a left-wing, working-class British government. He approached this task with the same unsentimental pragmatism that had defined his entire career. He realized immediately that the standard, polite routines of Washington diplomacy, the endless cocktail parties, the formal dinners, the highly choreographed social events, were largely useless in swaying hardline American politicians. He found the American social circuit tedious and deeply superficial compared to the high-stakes life-or-death negotiations he was accustomed to. Instead, he sought out direct, unvarnished conversations with the men who actually controlled the levers of American power. He built working relationships with figures like Secretary of State George Marshall and the fiercely intelligent Under-Secretary of State Dean Atchison. He leveraged his reputation as the man who had stood toe-to-toe with Stalin. When American politicians expressed doubts about the rising Soviet threat, Inverchapel spoke from direct, chilling experience. He provided the Truman administration with vital first-hand psychological profiles of the Soviet leadership, information that deeply influenced the formulation of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. He proved to the Americans that Britain, despite its financial ruin, remained the only reliable battle-tested ally capable of standing against Soviet expansion in Europe. While he successfully managed these monumental geopolitical shifts, the strain of his double life began to take a severe toll. The physical environment of Washington, with its crushing summer humidity, aggravated his declining health. But the psychological burden was far heavier. He was operating in the epicenter of a rapidly escalating anti-communist hysteria, a city where political careers were routinely destroyed by rumors of disloyalty or moral deviance. Within the heavily guarded walls of the British Embassy, Evgeny Yost remained the silent center of the ambassador's private world. The young Russian's existence in Washington was an astonishing historical anomaly. He was a Soviet citizen, legally bound to a hostile foreign power, living openly within the diplomatic headquarters of America's primary ally, serving as the intimate companion of the man entrusted with the most sensitive atomic and military secrets of the Western world. For Yost, the transition from Moscow to Washington must have been deeply alienating. He had escaped the overt, immediate threat of the Gulag, but he had traded it for a gilded cage. He was entirely dependent on Lord Inverchapel for his survival. If he left the embassy grounds, he was a potential target for Soviet intelligence agents operating in the United States, who would view him as a defector. Simultaneously, he was a prime target for the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover's agents knew exactly who Yost was and precisely why he was there. Yost existed in a permanent state of precarious invisibility, shielded solely by the political capital of the aging diplomat he served. The internal politics of the British government added another layer of supreme irony to the situation. The Foreign Secretary in London, the man to whom Lord Inverchapel reported directly, was Ernest Bevin. Bevin was a former trade union leader, a tough, unpolished working-class politician who fundamentally despised the aristocratic privilege of the Foreign Office. Under Bevin's government, the British police were executing a ruthless crackdown on homosexuality across the United Kingdom. Men of Bevin's own class were being thrown into prison by the thousands. Yet when it came to Lord Inverchapel, Bevin demonstrated absolute deliberate blindness. Bevin was a pragmatist above all else. He recognized that Inverchapel was arguably the most effective diplomat the British Empire possessed. Bevin needed American money, and he needed the American military committed to the defense of Europe. Inverchapel was delivering those results. The socialist minister and the aristocratic lord forged a highly effective, if unlikely, partnership based entirely on state survival. Bevin actively protected Inverchapel from conservative critics in London, ensuring that no inquiries were made into the ambassador's private arrangements. The rules, Bevin tacitly acknowledged, did not apply to men who held the fate of the nation in their hands. Despite the institutional protection, the relentless pressure of Washington eventually drained Inverchapel's reserves. The immediate crisis of the post-war transition had been managed. The loans were secured, the intelligence sharing agreements were solidified, and the blueprint for the NATO alliance was being drawn. The daily bureaucratic grind of managing this massive new transatlantic architecture required a different kind of diplomat, someone younger and more attuned to administrative detail. Inverchapel was a crisis manager, a man built for navigating the collapse of empires and the volatile personalities of dictators. He was not a bureaucrat. By early 1948, it was evident that his long career had reached its natural conclusion. He had spent over 4 decades serving the crown in the most volatile regions on Earth. He had manipulated the rigid structures of British society, outmaneuvered the Soviet secret police, and stared down the American intelligence apparatus, all while maintaining a private life that would have destroyed any ordinary citizen. The British government announced his GI retirement. He packed his belongings, finalized the transfer of his diplomatic authority, and prepared to leave Washington. The departure marked the end of an era, but it also initiated the final, most vulnerable chapter of his life. For over 40 years, the title of ambassador and the immense machinery of the British state had served as his armor. As he relinquished his post, that armor fell away. He was returning to a Britain fundamentally changed by the war, a country still rigidly bound by morality laws, but no longer willing to unconditionally defer to its aristocracy. The absolute immunity he had enjoyed across the globe was about to be tested by the reality of a quiet retirement in a society that had systematically criminalized his very existence. The transatlantic voyage back to Great Britain in the spring of 1948 marked the severing of Archibald Clark Kerr's protective tether. For over 40 years, the British government had functioned as his personal shield. He had operated under the assumption that his utility to the empire superseded the rule of law. That assumption was entirely correct as long as he remained in active service. But as he stepped off the ship in Southampton, no longer an ambassador but simply a retired peer of the realm, the terms of his existence fundamentally shifted. He was stripped of the diplomatic immunity that had walled him off from the local police forces of the world. He was now subject to the same legal machinery that governed the ordinary citizens of the United Kingdom. The country he returned to was embroiled in a vicious domestic crusade. The post-war British state, exhausted by the conflict and grappling with a crumbling empire, turned its anxieties inward. A profound moral panic was sweeping through the government and the press. The authorities launched a systematic, aggressive campaign to purge homosexuality from public life. The director of public prosecutions, Sir Theobald Matthew, directed police forces across the country to intensify their enforcement of the Labouchere Amendment. Arrests skyrocketed. The police utilized agent provocateurs, monitored public restrooms, and aggressively interrogated suspects to force them to surrender the names of their associates. This was the environment Lord Inverchapel was forced to navigate without the backing of the Foreign Office. He retreated to his ancestral estate on the shores of Loch Eck in Argyll, Scotland. The physical isolation of the Scottish Highlands provided a necessary buffer. The estate was vast, private, and removed from the aggressive policing of London. Yet the psychological transition was brutal. Men who have spent decades standing at the absolute center of global crises, men whose daily decisions dictate the movement of armies and the survival of nations, rarely adapt well to silence. The adrenaline of statecraft had sustained him through physical illness and the immense stress of his double life. Without it, his physical and mental health rapidly deteriorated. The situation surrounding Evgeny Yost became increasingly complex. Lord Inverchapel had successfully extracted the young Russian from the jaws of the Soviet state and navigated him through the surveillance nets of Washington. But in rural Scotland, Yost was profoundly isolated. He was an alien in a deeply conservative insular community. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship in Moscow and America shifted. Yost was no longer a hidden asset within a bustling embassy. He was a highly visible foreign young man living with a retired, unmarried aristocrat. The arrangement, stripped of its diplomatic cover, was legally perilous. While Inverchapel's peerage and immense wealth still provided a formidable barrier against local law enforcement, Scottish police were highly unlikely to raid the estate of a lord who had just served alongside Churchill and Stalin. The constant underlying threat of exposure was unavoidable. The British press was beginning to hunt for scandals to sell newspapers, and the old aristocratic codes of silence were slowly eroding. Inverchapel had to rely entirely on his remaining social capital to ensure local authorities looked the other way. He had essentially traded the geopolitical tightrope of the Cold War for a domestic tightrope of sheer survival. His marriage of convenience to Maria Theresa, which had served its purpose brilliantly for 2 decades, finally fractured under the weight of this new reality. They had lived highly separate lives for years, united only for official functions and diplomatic photographs. With his career concluded, the necessity of the facade vanished. They separated, finalizing the dissolution of the operational shield he had built in 1929. He was now entirely exposed, an aging man living on the margins of a society he had spent his life defending, alongside a companion whose very presence incriminated them both. The contradictions of his existence crystallized in these final years. He was a man who had manipulated the most powerful figures of the 20th century. He had shaped the borders of post-war Europe and helped construct the alliance that would define the next 50 years. He possessed an intellect capable of dismantling the arguments of Soviet hardliners and American isolationists alike. Yet, in his own country, he was legally defined as a criminal. He was forced to live in a state of quiet, perpetual anxiety, knowing that a single misstep, a disgruntled former employee, or an ambitious local policeman could bring the entire weight of the British penal system crashing down upon him. He witnessed from a distance the ongoing destruction of men from lower social classes. He read the newspaper reports of civil servants, teachers, and laborers being sent to prison for the exact same behaviors he had engaged in globally with absolute impunity. The British establishment, which had actively protected him when he was useful, offered no such protection to the general public. He was the ultimate beneficiary of a corrupt, class-based system of justice. He understood better than anyone that his freedom was not a right but a transaction. He had purchased his immunity with his diplomatic brilliance, and now that his utility was exhausted, he was forced to hide behind the stone walls of his estate, hoping his accumulated prestige would last until he died. The twilight of Archibald Clark Kerr's life at Loch Eck was defined by a profound, heavy silence. The world he had helped shape was rapidly accelerating into the nuclear age, while he was confined to the damp, quiet shores of the Scottish Highlands. The geopolitical architecture he had painstakingly negotiated, the Anglo-American alliance, the containment lines against the Soviet bloc, the financial restructuring of Western Europe, was now in the hands of younger, more conventional bureaucrats. These new men, the emerging technocrats of the 1950s, lack the aristocratic untouchability of Lord Inverchapel's generation. They operated in a climate of absolute paranoia, where any deviation from the norm was viewed as a terminal security threat. By 1950, the political atmosphere in Britain and the United States had grown completely toxic. The FBI and the CIA were exerting massive pressure on British intelligence services to clean house. Washington viewed the British establishment as dangerously lax, overly reliant on the outdated assumption that a gentleman from the right public school could never betray his country, regardless of his personal vices. This American pressure forced MI5 and MI6 to adopt aggressive, systematic vetting processes. The old system of blind eyes and quiet accommodations was being dismantled brick by brick. Lord Inverchapel watched this transformation from his estate, entirely aware that the shield that had protected him for 4 decades was gone. Had he been a decade younger and still in active service, the new transatlantic security protocols would have undoubtedly targeted him. The FBI dossier sitting in J. Edgar Hoover's office would have been weaponized by the Americans to force his removal. He had survived simply by outlasting the era of tolerance. He was a relic of a time when personal brilliance could outweigh systemic rules. The isolation at Loch Eck was especially acute for Evgeny Yost. He remained by Inverchapel's side, functioning as a companion and caretaker as the former ambassador's health began to fail. Yost's legal status in the United Kingdom was entirely tethered to a man who no longer held official power. He was a Soviet exile living in a country obsessed with Soviet spies, residing with a prominent British lord in a society that actively hunted and imprisoned homosexuals. The psychological strain of this dual vulnerability must have been immense. Yost could not integrate into the local Scottish community, nor could he return to the Soviet Union, where Stalin's purges were intensifying in the dictator's final years. He was trapped in a highly precarious limbo, entirely dependent on Inverchapel's lingering prestige and wealth to keep the local authorities at bay. The stark reality of Britain's two-tiered justice system was about to be laid bare in the most brutal manner possible, precisely during these final years. While Inverchapel lived out his retirement in unbothered comfort, the British state was preparing to crush men of lesser standing who had provided equally vital services to the nation. The most glaring tragic parallel is the fate of Alan Turing. Turing, the brilliant mathematician who cracked the German Enigma code and arguably shortened the Second World War by years, was arrested by British police in 1952. Turing was not an aristocrat. He did not belong to the elite diplomatic clubs of Whitehall. When he was discovered to be homosexual, his immense contributions to national survival meant absolutely nothing to the judicial system. He was publicly humiliated, stripped of his security clearance, and forced to undergo chemical castration, driving him to suicide. Inverchapel, conversely, faced no police raids. No constables knocked on the heavy wooden doors of his estate to inquire about his living arrangements. The local police, deferring to his title and his formidable reputation, granted him the ultimate luxury. They left him alone. The contrast is sharp and unforgiving. It proves that the law in mid-century Britain was not a universal standard of morality, but a weapon selectively deployed based on class, wealth, and institutional utility. The fragile bubble at Loch Eck burst suddenly. In July 1951, Archibald Clark Kerr, Lord Inverchapel, suffered a heart attack and died rapidly. He was 69 years old. His death was swift, sparing him a prolonged physical decline, but it immediately stripped away the final layer of protection surrounding Evgeny Yost. The British establishment moved with mechanical efficiency to manage the aftermath. Official obituaries praised Inverchapel as a titan of diplomacy, the indispensable man of Moscow, and the architect of the post-war alliance. High-ranking politicians and fellow diplomats attended his memorials. The complex, contradictory realities of his private life, his manipulation of the law, and the existence of his Russian companion were entirely erased from the public narrative. The state sanitized his legacy, ensuring that the history books recorded only the official triumphs of the ambassador, leaving the private transgressions of the man permanently buried. For Yost, the death of his protector meant immediate, profound vulnerability. Inverchapel left him a financial provision in his will, a final act of loyalty to ensure the young man he had smuggled out of the Soviet Union would not face absolute destitution. However, money could not buy the aristocratic immunity that had kept Yost safe. With Inverchapel gone, Yost was forced to fade entirely into the background of a hostile society. The historical record regarding Evgeny Yost Practica, Ahali vanishes after 1951. He disappeared into the quiet, terrified anonymity that characterized the lives of thousands of gay men in Britain before the decriminalization of homosexuality in 1967. He survived the wrath of Stalin and the surveillance of Hoover, only to be abandoned to the cold legal machinery of the British state. Inverchapel's story serves as a stark blueprint of elite self-preservation. He didn't defeat his country's laws. He simply proved that at the highest levels of the empire, morality was never a universal standard. It was a currency, quietly exchanged for geopolitical survival.